There is a specific kind of silence that happens when a man walks out of his own house for the last time, not because he wants to, because the locks have already been changed. And if you have ever stood in a moment like that, or if you have ever watched someone you love stand in a moment like that, then you already know that no word in the English language adequately describes what that silence sounds like from the inside. It is not grief exactly. It is not anger exactly. It is something older than both of those things, something that lives below language, something that settles into a man's chest, like concrete, and stays there until he decides, one way or another, what he is going to do with it. Marcus didn't drive away that morning. He had no car. He didn't call anyone. He had no phone plan. He sat down on the concrete curb outside the house he had spent 11 years paying for, on a street in Greensboro, North Carolina, where his children had learned to ride their bikes, where his neighbors still waved at him by name, and he counted what he had left. 2 folded $100 bills, 150, a handful of crumpled fives, and ones that he had to smooth flat against his knee just to make sense of. $500.23. That was it. That was the full accounting of a man's financial life after a divorce that had taken 18 months and left almost nothing standing. And yet, 2 years after that morning, Marcus Dwayne Holloway was sitting in front of a national television camera, with a gleaming food truck parked behind him and a line of customers stretching halfway down the block, telling his story to an audience of millions. And somewhere across the city of Greensboro, in the house on Clover Street, a woman turned up the volume on her television set and went completely still. Before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And please do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because this channel is about stories that are real, complicated, fully human. And this one right here is one of the most extraordinary we have ever told. Now, let us go back to the very beginning, because to understand what Marcus built, you have to understand what he came from. And to understand what he came from, you have to understand something about a city and a family and a way of cooking that is about much more than food. Greensboro, North Carolina is not the kind of city that shows up in most national conversations about American success stories. It is not Atlanta. It is not Nashville. It is not one of those southern cities that has been reclaimed by a wave of transplants and rebranded as the next great place to be. Greensboro is just Greensboro, a mid-sized city in the Piedmont region of North Carolina, built on textile mills and tobacco money, and the kind of quiet, persistent community that does not need to be celebrated by outsiders to know its own worth. It is a city with a history. The Woolworth's lunch counter sit-in, one of the defining moments of the American Civil Rights Movement, happened in Greensboro in 1960, when 4 black college students sat down and refused to get up. The city has carried that particular brand of quiet defiance in its bones ever since. Marcus Dwayne Holloway was born into that city in 1979, the second of 4 children, and he absorbed its particular character in the way that children absorb everything around them, before they have words for it. His mother, a woman named Dorothy, cooked every single day of his childhood, not because cooking was her hobby or her identity or her passion in the way that word gets used today, because cooking was how the family survived. It was how love got expressed in a household where money was not plentiful, and words did not always come easy. Dorothy Holloway made something out of nothing at that stove, and she did it with the kind of skill and economy and intentionality that Marcus would not fully understand until he was a grown man standing at his own stove, trying to figure out how she had done it. Braised short ribs from the cheaper cuts of meat, collard greens cooked so low and so slow that they became something almost philosophical, cornbread made from memory, no recipe, no measuring cups, just the feel of the batter and 40 years of knowing. Marcus watched her do all of this from the time he could stand at the counter, and the knowledge passed into him the way real knowledge passes between people who are paying attention, not through instruction, but through presence. His father, a man named Robert, worked double shifts at a textile plant for most of Marcus's childhood. He was not a man who talked much. He expressed himself through reliability. He was there when he said he would be there. He provided what he said he would provide. He did not complain about the hours or the wages or the physical toll that kind of work takes on a body over decades, and Marcus absorbed that too. the particular posture of a man who decides that the work is the work, and the work gets done, and you do not spend energy you do not have on resentment about the circumstances. That lesson would matter later. It would matter enormously. Marcus was not a scholar. He was not a natural student in the way that school rewards. He was curious and observant and deeply intelligent in the specific way that people are intelligent, when they learn best by doing, rather than by reading. But the American educational system in the 1990s had limited patience for that particular kind of intelligence, and Marcus moved through school without distinction, graduated in 1997, and enrolled at Guilford Technical Community College, with no clear plan and no particular passion, except the one he had been carrying since he was old enough to stand at his mother's kitchen counter. He tried for 2 years. He took general education courses and business classes and did reasonably well in all of them. But the thing he kept returning to, the thing that pulled at him when his mind wandered in a lecture hall, was food. Not food as a concept or a career category, but food as a practice, as a daily act of creation, as the thing that his mother had done every single day of his childhood, and that had made the whole family feel held. He dropped out of community college in 1999 and got a job at a restaurant called Daddy Ray's, a barbecue and soul food spot on the east side of Greensboro that had been feeding the neighborhood since 1974. He was hired to wash dishes. Within 8 months, he was on the line. Within 2 years, he was training new hires. The owner, a man named Raymond Thompson, who everyone simply called Daddy Ray, said later that Marcus was the most naturally gifted cook he had ever employed in 30 years of running that kitchen. And what Daddy Ray meant by naturally gifted was not that Marcus had technique, though he did develop excellent technique. What he meant was that Marcus understood food the way some people understand music intuitively from the inside, in a way that cannot be fully taught because it exists below the level of instruction. He knew what a dish needed before he could articulate why he knew it. He tasted things and understood their architecture. He understood that Southern cooking, real Southern cooking, is not just a collection of recipes. It is a philosophy about patience and about transformation. It is the art of taking something that has been overlooked or discarded and making it extraordinary through time and heat and care and attention. Marcus understood that at 20 years old. He would spend the rest of his life proving it. But let us talk about what happened before the food truck, because you cannot understand the food truck without understanding the marriage, and you cannot understand the marriage without understanding that it was, for a long time, genuinely good. Marcus met Sandra Renee Mitchell in the summer of 2003 at a church fish fry on the south side of Greensboro. He was 23 years old and had recently taken a job as a line cook at a hotel restaurant downtown, a step up from Daddy Ray's in terms of pay and professional development, though he would say for the rest of his life that he learned more in Daddy Ray's kitchen than in any hotel. Sandra was 24, working as a receptionist at a dental office, and she was, by every account of people who knew her then, exactly the kind of woman who makes a room feel warmer by being in it. She was quick to laugh. She was direct, in a way that people either found refreshing or slightly challenging, depending on their own temperament. She had grown up in the same general part of Greensboro that Marcus had gone to a different high school, had one of those parallel childhoods that people growing up in the same mid-sized southern city often have, close enough in geography and experience to feel like destiny when they finally meet far enough apart in the details to feel like discovery. They dated for 2 years. They were not in a hurry. This is worth noting because it says something about both of them, about their shared disposition towards deliberateness, toward building something correctly, rather than quickly. They got married in June of 2005 in a ceremony at Mount Zion Baptist Church that Dorothy Holloway catered herself, and the food, by all accounts, was better than the wedding itself, which was also quite good. They bought a house in 2008, a 3-bedroom ranch home on Clover Street, right at the moment when the financial crisis had made buying a house feel simultaneously brave and terrifying, which is perhaps the ideal emotional context for any major commitment. They chose to do it anyway. That too says something about them. Their son Jalen was born in 2009, their daughter Amara in 2011, and Marcus, by every account, was the kind of father who showed up. Not occasionally, not when it was convenient, but consistently, reliably. in the specific daily way that children need and remember. He was at the school plays. He was at the t-ball games. He made Saturday morning pancakes in shapes that required more time than any reasonable adult should spend on breakfast, and he spent it anyway, because Jalen wanted dinosaurs and Amara wanted stars. And Marcus had learned from his own father that showing up is not the floor of parenting. It is the whole house. For a long time it worked. The family worked. Not perfectly, because no family works perfectly, but genuinely. Sandra had been promoted from receptionist to office manager at the dental practice. Marcus had worked his way up to sous chef at the hotel and was earning a salary that, combined with Sandra's income, gave the family a stability that felt earned and real. They went to church on Sundays. They took the kids to Carowinds in the summer. They had people over for dinner, and Marcus always cooked. And the dinner parties were the kind that people talked about afterward in the specific way that means the food was extraordinary. But there was a tension underneath all of this, a tension that had been there since early in the marriage and had never fully resolved, only shifted and evolved into different forms over the years. And the tension was this. Marcus had a dream that Sandra had, over time, stopped believing in. Since his early 20s, since his days at Daddy Ray's, Marcus had been quietly nursing the idea of his own place. Not a grand restaurant empire, just a place. A neighborhood spot that served the food he had grown up eating, made the way it was supposed to be made, with the time and care and intention it required. He had notebooks full of menus and ideas, had run the numbers in his head and on paper hundreds of times, had thought about it the way some people think about writing a novel, as the real work that exists underneath the work you do to survive. Sandra had supported it early on. She had listened to him talk about it in the early years of the marriage, with genuine interest and genuine belief. But support, over time, had shifted into something quieter and more complicated. Not hostility, not contempt, something more like exhaustion. The exhaustion of a woman who had watched her husband carry this dream for more than a decade without moving decisively toward it. Who had her own anxieties about money and stability, and what it meant to bet the family's security on a restaurant in a city with a notoriously difficult restaurant landscape. She had 2 children in school. She had a mortgage. She had practical concerns that felt, to her, like they should take precedence, at least for now, at least until the kids were older, at least until they had more cushion, at least. And Marcus had heard all of those at leasts, had heard them, and over time, had come to feel that each one was not just a practical concern but a verdict on him, a quiet, never quite stated judgment that the dream was not serious, that he was not serious, that Sandra had calculated his chances and found them insufficient. Now, to be completely fair, and this story demands that we be completely fair to everyone in it, Sandra had not made that judgment explicitly. She had not sat across a table from Marcus and said, "I do not believe in you." What she had done was more human than that, and more complicated than that. She had simply gradually redirected her faith toward the things she could see and count and plan around, and had let her faith in the things she could not see quietly, without announcement, without drama, move somewhere else. That shift, that gradual migration of faith, created a distance between them that neither of them fully acknowledged for years. They did not fight about it, not really. They talked around it, in the way that couples who love each other and are afraid of what a real fight might cost will talk around the thing that is slowly widening between them. By 2015, the food truck conversations. Marcus had pivoted from restaurant to food truck as a more realistic first step, had become a kind of code for everything else they were not saying to each other. The conversations were not really about a food truck. They were about trust. They were about whether Sandra believed Marcus would do what he said he was going to do. They were about whether Marcus believed Sandra still saw the person he actually was. They were having the wrong argument, as couples so often are, with tremendous sincerity and commitment to the wrong argument. And neither of them had found the words to name the right one. By 2016, they were living in the same house and growing in separate directions. And both of them knew it, and neither of them was ready to say it. And then Sandra was ready to say it, and she said it, and the machinery of ending a marriage began to move. Here is something that most people do not know about the practical mechanics of divorce in the United States. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, approximately 78% of custodial parents in America are mothers. That means that in roughly 8 out of 10 divorces, where children are involved, the children go with the mother as the primary custodial parent, and the father becomes the person who has his children on alternating weekends, and one evening per week if he is fortunate, and pays child support based on his income, and drives away from the house he used to live in, and tries to figure out how to remain a real presence in his children's lives from the outside. That is not a story about villains. That is a story about how a legal and social system has evolved, with the best intentions for children, in ways that have profound consequences for the men who move through it. Marcus moved through it in 2017, when Sandra filed for divorce, and he moved through 18 months of legal proceedings that, when they concluded in the fall of 2018, had produced an outcome that was, by every legal standard, fair, and that felt, by every human standard, like the removal of the floor. Sandra received primary physical custody of Jalen and Amara. Marcus received visitation on alternating weekends and Wednesday evenings. The house on Clover Street, where Jalen had learned to walk, and Amara had named the oak tree in the backyard, went to Sandra as the primary custodial parent. The 2014 Honda Pilot they had bought to get together went to Sandra as the primary transport for the children. Marcus was ordered to pay $1,100 per month in child support, based on his hotel salary. Legal fees had consumed most of what was in their joint accounts. What remained after the final accounting, after the attorneys and the court costs, and the 18 months of a marriage being divided up on spreadsheets, was $500.23, and a duffel bag of clothes, and a collection of knives and cast-iron pans, and a spiral notebook full of recipes. And he sat on the curb on Clover Street with all of that on a Tuesday morning in October 2018. And the neighborhood was still asleep, and the silence was the specific kind of silence that has no name. His brother Darnell, 2 years older and living in Charlotte, offered his couch. Marcus accepted for 2 weeks and said, with a certainty that Darnell would later describe as equal parts inspiring and alarming, that he was getting a truck. Darnell assumed he meant a moving truck. Marcus did not mean a moving truck. Before we go any further, let us just take a moment to appreciate something about what Marcus did next, because it is easy, in the telling of a comeback story, to compress the time and make it seem like resilience is a decision you make on a Tuesday and execute by the weekend. It is not. It is a decision you make on a Tuesday and then make again on Wednesday, when you wake up on your brother's couch, and the weight of everything you have lost is sitting directly on your chest, before you have even opened your eyes. It is a decision you make again on Thursday and Friday, and every single day for months and then years, before the decision stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like who you are. What Marcus did next was not heroic in the way that movies make things heroic. It was heroic in the only way that actually matters, which is that he did it anyway, every day, without an audience, without a guarantee, without any real evidence that it was going to work. He spent his first week on Darnell's couch making calls. He had a friend who ran a commercial kitchen that sat idle on weekends, and the friend owed him a favor from years back, and Marcus called in that favor and got access to the kitchen for Saturdays at no cost. He went to a Facebook marketplace listing and bought a used commercial food processor for $60. He bought a propane burner setup for $85. He spent $140 on his first ingredient run, flour and proteins and produce and the specific spice blends he had been developing and refining since his Daddy Ray's days. He paid $50 for a North Carolina business license application. He printed 50 menus at the FedEx store for $22. He put $40 aside for gas money and kept the remaining $103 as an emergency fund. He had been in business for 1 week and he had not yet made a single dollar, but he had a plan, which is a different thing from having money. And in some situations, it is a more important thing. The first event was a neighborhood block association cookout in Charlotte in November of 2018, a Saturday afternoon in a park 2 miles from Darnell's house. Marcus showed up with his propane burners and his folding table, and a canopy he borrowed from Darnell, and enough food to serve roughly 40 people. He was charging $8 a plate for what he was calling a Southern Comfort Box, which was a scoop of braised short rib over white rice, a generous serving of collard greens cooked the way his mother had taught him, a piece of cornbread that he had been up since 4 in the morning to bake, and a small container of the sweet heat sauce that he had been developing and refining for the better part of 15 years. He had done the math. If he sold 40 plates, he would clear $100 above his ingredient costs. He would use that $100 to fund the next event. He sold 40 plates in the first hour. He sold 40 more in the second hour before he ran out of food. He had made $340 net in one afternoon with a folding table and 2 propane burners. He drove back to Darnell's house, went to the bathroom, and cried in the shower for 20 minutes. Not because anything was fixed. Nothing was fixed. He still had nothing. He still could not afford a motel room for more than a few nights running. He was still sleeping on his brother's couch and paying $1,100 a month in child support that he could barely cover. He cried because of the $340. He cried because it was proof. Not proof that everything was going to be all right. Not proof that the plan would work, but proof that the thing he had been carrying in his notebook for 15 years was real, that the food was real, that people would pay for it and come back for more and tell their friends, that the 40 years of watching his mother at that stove had transferred into him and were still there, intact, waiting. He dried off. He went back to the kitchen table. He opened the notebook. From November of 2018 to March of 2019, Marcus ran pop-up events every single weekend that he did not have his children. Farmers markets in Charlotte and in the parts of Greensboro where he still had connections. Church events. A Juneteenth celebration in a park in the university area of Charlotte where he ran out of short ribs within 90 minutes and had to offer rain checks, which he honored the following week without being asked. A birthday party for a woman named Beverly who ate her Southern Comfort box and then immediately got out her phone and called her sister and 3 friends while still chewing. Beverly became a recurring character in the story of Marcus's table, the kind of person that every small business needs in its early days and rarely gets to choose, a natural evangelist who told everyone she knew and then told them again. Beverly brought 11 people to his next event. 3 of them became regulars. One of them, a man named Gerald who ran a small events and venue booking company in Charlotte, stopped Marcus after the event to talk. Gerald had watched Marcus work the folding table for 3 hours and had noticed something that most people who were simply eating the food had not been paying attention to. He had noticed the efficiency, the total lack of waste, the way Marcus organized his prep and his service so that every plate came out in roughly the same time and at the same quality as the first one. Gerald had seen a lot of catering operations in his years of running events. He had never seen one person, alone at a folding table, run 40 plates an hour without a single plate being wrong. He gave Marcus his card and said, "When you are ready to do events, call me." Marcus called him 6 weeks later. By April of 2019, Marcus had saved just over $4,000. This was not enough for a real food truck, a used food truck in operating condition, the kind that has a commercial kitchen installed and a generator and passes health department inspection, runs anywhere from $15,000 to $40,000, depending on the age and condition and what market you are buying in. $4,000 was not that. But Marcus was not looking for a real food truck. He was looking for a truck, a vehicle, something he could build into a real food truck over time, with his own hands, and whatever help he could find, because he understood by then that he was not going to be able to buy his way to where he needed to be. He was going to have to build his way there. He found the truck on a Tuesday morning in late April, a 1999 Ford Econoline step van that had been used to deliver ice cream in Mecklenburg County until the freezer units failed, at which point the owner had parked it in a gravel lot and listed it online for $3,500. Marcus talked him down to $3,200. He paid in cash, kept $800 in reserve, and drove the truck back to Darnell's driveway, where he sat in the cab for a long time, looking at the cracked dashboard, and the ghost popsicle smell, and the peeling paint on the exterior, and decided that this was the foundation. Darnell came out and stood next to him in the driveway and looked at the truck for a while and then said, very carefully, "Are you sure about this?" Marcus said, "No, let us get to work." What happened over the next 3 months in that driveway is, in many ways, the most remarkable part of the entire story, because of what it reveals about the community that had quietly formed around Marcus, without him fully recognizing it. Word had gotten around, through the pop-up circuit, through the farmers markets, and the church events and the birthday party network that Beverly had personally activated, that Marcus was building something, and people showed up to help. a retired electrician named Curtis, who Marcus knew from his church back in Greensboro, drove up to Charlotte 3 Saturdays in a row and rewired the entire truck's electrical system at no charge, saying only that he wanted to see what Marcus was going to do with it. A woman named Tracy, who owned a sign and graphics shop in Charlotte, designed the truck's exterior branding, working evenings after her regular clients were done, and charged only for materials. She did the design in exchange for the satisfaction of the work, she said, and also because, in her words, "I just knew this was going to be on TV someday." She said that in June of 2019, that fact becomes important later. A plumber Marcus had met at a community business association event installed the truck's water system in a single Saturday, refusing payment and accepting 2 Southern Comfort boxes instead. A former restaurant manager Marcus had worked with years ago at the hotel came by one weekend to help design the kitchen layout, maximizing the functional space in what was a very small and awkward footprint, and the layout he designed is essentially the layout that Marcus's table still uses today. None of this happened because Marcus asked for it. People came because they had tasted the food, because they had watched him work, because there is a kind of person, rare but recognizable, who produces in others the instinct to be useful, who makes people want to be part of what they are building, not because of charisma or performance, or the deliberate cultivation of a personal brand, but because of something older and quieter than all of that, the simple integrity of a person who is doing the exact thing they are supposed to be doing in the world. Marcus was that person, and people could feel it. Now here is the part of the story that most people, when they share it on social media or talk about it at their kitchen table, tend to skip over, because it is less comfortable than the comeback narrative, less clean than the triumph arc, and it requires us to hold two things in our minds at the same time that our culture is not always good at holding together. While Marcus was building that truck in Darnell's driveway, Sandra was managing 2 children, a full-time job, a house, a dog that Amara had named Captain, and the specific emotional complexity of being a woman who had ended a marriage that she had also genuinely loved, who was raising children who missed their father, who was watching, through the filtered lens of mutual friends and occasional overlapping social circles. The Sand she had divorced begin to build the thing he had always said he was going to build. This is not simple to sit with. It requires a kind of honesty that most people, understandably, prefer not to extend to someone they are in conflict with. Sandra was not celebrating. She was not vindicated. She was not the person that the internet, when it later got hold of the stories, would decide she was. She was a woman who was tired, and who was doing the best she could, and who was, privately, feeling something about Marcus's emergence that she did not have a clean name for. Pride would not be quite right. Regret would not be quite right. The closest description that a person who knew her well offered, when speaking about this period, was this: she looked like someone doing fast math and not being sure she liked what the numbers were adding up to. In August of 2019, Sandra's attorney filed a motion to modify child support. This is the moment in the story where a lot of people choose their side and stop listening. Please do not do that yet. What the motion argued was straightforward and legally sound. Marcus's income had changed significantly since the original support order had been calculated based on his hotel salary. The pop-up business was generating documented revenue. The original order, the attorney argued, no longer accurately reflected Marcus's financial circumstances, and the children, who were the people the order existed to protect, should benefit proportionally from both their parents' incomes. This is not a controversial legal argument. It is, in fact, the argument that the child support modification system was designed to facilitate. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, approximately 78% of custodial parents who are owed child support are mothers, and the average payment received is significantly below what courts actually award, because non-payment and underpayment are endemic problems in the system. Sandra filing a modification motion was not an act of aggression. It was an act of parenting. Marcus received the papers on a Thursday. He had a pop-up scheduled for that Saturday. He went. He served over 200 plates. It was his best number yet. On Monday, he called his attorney and said, "Tell me the number she is asking for, and I will figure it out." His attorney told him the proposed figure. Marcus said, "All right." His attorney, who had been doing family law for 22 years and had seen a lot of reactions, to a lot of proposed figures. Later, that Marx's response was one of the most extraordinary things he had encountered in his practice. Not because it was large or dramatic, because it was quiet, because Marcus had received what was, by any measure, difficult news, and his response had been not to rage or strategize or retreat into bitterness, but simply to say, all right, and to go back to work. On September 14, 2019, Marcus's table opened for business as a permitted, licensed, health department-approved food truck operating from a corner spot near the Noda Neighborhood Farmers Market in Charlotte, a location that Gerald, the events man, had helped him secure through his connections with the market's management. Marcus arrived at 5 in the morning. He set up alone. The generator ran without complaint for the first time all summer, and he took it, privately, as a sign. He had the short ribs in the steam table by 8:30. The cornbread, baked that morning starting at 4, was stacked and ready. The collard greens had been going since 6, low and slow, the way they needed to go. By 9 o'clock, there was a line that stretched to the corner. By noon, he was sold out. He had not planned to sell out by noon. He had not made enough food for a noon sellout. He closed the service window, sat down on the floor of the truck with the last plate he had not yet served, and ate it by himself in the afternoon, quiet of a parking lot in Charlotte, and it tasted like the best meal of his life. Over the next 6 months, Marcus's table became something that Charlotte had not quite seen before, not because the food was exotic, or trend-forward, or designed to be photographed, although it photographed beautifully, but because it was the opposite of all of those things. It was food that tasted like it had come from somewhere specific and meant something specific, like someone's grandmother had made it and was watching to make sure you ate every bite. The collard greens cooked so low and so slow that they had become something soft and deep and complex. Nothing like the bitter, underdone greens that bad soul food restaurants serve to people who have never had the real thing. The short ribs braised until they fell at the suggestion of a fork, in a liquid that markets had been refining for years, built on a base of aromatics and a patience that most commercial kitchens cannot economically afford. The cornbread, which deserves its own extended discussion, made from a recipe that Marcus had adapted from his mother's formula, over 15 years of iteration, and that people consistently described, not as the best cornbread they had ever eaten, but as the cornbread they had been trying to remember their whole lives, the one from some Sunday dinner in their grandmother's house that they had been chasing ever since. The truck developed a following that was, from the beginning, strikingly consistent in its demographics. The core customer base skewed older than most food truck audiences. Women over 40 formed the majority of regular customers and were overwhelmingly responsible for the truck's organic word-of-mouth growth, because women in that demographic are, without question, the most powerful marketing engine that a soul food operation can have. They know the food. They have the comparison points. They know what it is supposed to taste like because they ate it growing up. And when they taste something that is actually right, they tell everyone they know. And they come back and they bring people with them, and they remember it. Beverly was not an anomaly. Beverly was the beginning of a pattern. By the spring of 2020, Marcus had a waiting list for catering. A waiting list for a single food truck operated by one man with 2 part-time helpers on the busiest days. And then the pandemic arrived, and in the space of a week, every event was canceled, every market was closed, every catering contract was suspended, and Marcus stood in his truck in an empty parking lot and looked at the situation and decided, in 72 hours, what he was going to do about it. He pivoted to delivery. He posted on Facebook and Instagram that Marcus's table was offering contactless meal delivery in family-size portions, available by order, placed the evening before, delivered by noon the following day, covering routes through Charlotte and the parts of Greensboro, where he still had a customer base. He priced the family meal boxes at $45. He cooked in the commercial kitchen he rented by the hour. He drove the routes himself, 7 days a week, because there was no one else, and because he did not know another way to do things. And in the first month of lockdown, when the entire restaurant and food service industry was contracting in a panic, Marcus's revenue tripled. It tripled because the pandemic had not made people less hungry. It had made them lonelier. And food, specifically food that tasted like someone had made it for you, like someone had taken the time to do it right, was one of the few things that could reach through a closed door and make a person feel less alone. Marcus had understood that his whole life. His mother had taught him that his whole life. And in the spring of 2020, in the middle of a global pandemic, the market caught up with what Marcus had always known. By September of 2020, he had a second truck. By the following February, a third. He had hired 8 people, including his brother Darnell, who had been skeptical about the Econoline step van in his driveway in the spring of 2019, and was now managing daily operations with the particular converted zeal of someone who had doubted a thing and been proved spectacularly wrong. Gerald was booking exclusive catering contracts. Tracy, the sign shop woman who had predicted the television appearance in June of 2019, was designing livery for all 3 trucks and had become, in the specific and irreplaceable way of people who show up early and stay, part of the core identity of the brand. Marcus paid his child support on time every month, sometimes early. He had expanded his Wednesday evening time with the kids to include occasional additional days when Sandra's schedule required flexibility, and he covered those without discussion or negotiation, because his children needed him. And the schedule was a floor, not a ceiling. Jalen, who was 11 by the spring of 2020, had started asking to come to the truck. Not visit, but to work. Marcus taught him how to prep, how to hold a knife correctly, how to taste and adjust, how to tell when the braising liquid needs more time without looking at a clock. Amara, who was 9, was quieter about it, but no less interested. She watched the business side. She asked questions about pricing and margins that a 9-year-old should not be asking, and that Marcus answered honestly, because his daughters wanted to understand. And he had learned early that the worst thing you can do for a child who wants to understand something is protect them from the understanding. In October of 2021, a production company based in Atlanta reached out. They were developing a segment for a nationally syndicated daytime television program, the kind that airs in the mid-morning block and has an audience of several million people, predominantly women between 40 and 65, predominantly in the South and Midwest, predominantly exactly the demographic that had been the engine of Marcus's table from the beginning. The production company had been searching for real resilience stories, genuine ones, not the kind that have been packaged and polished into something that resembles an Instagram caption. They had been pointed toward Marcus by Keisha, a food blogger with 80,000 Instagram followers who had come to the truck in February of 2020, right before the pandemic, after seeing a local news segment on Black-owned food businesses in Charlotte. Keisha's post about Marcus's table, a photograph of the short rib box with a caption about having been to Paris and New Orleans and never tasting anything that made her feel more at home than this, had gotten 22,000 likes and had introduced Marcus's table to an audience that his individual social media presence would have taken years to reach. Marcus almost said no to the television appearance. He sat with the offer for a week. His hesitation was not about the attention or the exposure. It was about the kids. Jalen was 12, Amara was 10, and Marcus had been careful, with a discipline that the people around him found remarkable, to never put the divorce into a public narrative. He had never posted about it. He had never mentioned it in the local news coverage he had received. He had never framed it as a story about what Sandra had taken from him, because he understood, in a way that his attorney and his friends and his social media followers did not always understand, that the moment he made it that story, his children would eventually and read it and be shaped by it. And he was not willing to do that to them. He called Darnell. He called his pastor. He called Gerald. They all said the same thing in different words. This is bigger than you now. Let people see what $500 can become. He called the production company back and said yes, with 2 conditions. The children would not be identified by name, face, or school, and the story would not be framed as a story about his ex-wife. The production company agreed to both conditions without hesitation. Marcus said one more thing. He said, "I do not want this to embarrass anyone. Make sure that is understood." They said it was understood. The segment filmed over 2 days in October of 2021. Marcus cooked on camera. He talked about his father, about the double shifts at the textile plant, and what they had taught him about showing up. He talked about Daddy Ray's, about the first time he understood that cooking was not just a skill but a language he had been fluent in since before he knew he was speaking it. He talked about the motel room and the $500 and the spiral notebook and the folding table at the Block Association cookout in November of 2018. He talked about his children, about Jalen's strong opinions on the cornbread recipe that Marcus pretended to disagree with and had secretly incorporated, about Amara's unsettling grasp of business fundamentals at age 10. He did not mention the divorce proceedings. He did not mention the house or the car or the asset division. He said, very simply, that he had gone through a difficult period in his personal life and had responded by doing the only thing he had ever known how to do, which was cook. And when the host asked him what it felt like to be sitting in front of a food truck with a line around the corner instead of in a motel room counting $500, he thought about it for a long time before he answered. And what he said was this. He said, "It feels like what happens when you do not let the grief win. Not that the grief goes away. It does not go away. But there is a difference between carrying grief and being carried by it." He said, "I decided to carry it, and I cooked." The studio audience went quiet for a moment. Then they applauded. Several people were visibly moved. The host had to take a breath before the next question. The segment aired on a Tuesday morning in November of 2021 at 10:15 in the morning, Central and Eastern Time, on a program with a national audience of over 3 million viewers. And in a house on Clover Street in Greensboro, North Carolina, a woman who had taken the day off for a dentist appointment and some errands turned up the volume on the television in her kitchen and went completely still. Sandra heard his voice before she saw his face. She had been half-day attending to the television the way people do when they have the news on in the background, while they do something else. But something in the cadence of his voice, the specific unhurried quality of it, the way Marcus had always talked, like he was not in any hurry to get to the end of a sentence because the sentence itself was worth taking time with, pulled her attention up from her phone and toward the screen. She stood in her kitchen and she watched her ex-husband tell his story on national television. And the expression on her face was not the one that the internet, when it later got hold of this story, decided it should have been. It was not triumphant. It was not wounded. It was not guilty or defensive or calculating. It was the expression of a person encountering complexity they had not prepared for. The person who knew him in that story on the screen was the same person she had shared 11 years with. This is the same person who had made the dinosaur pancakes and shown up for every t-ball game and opened that notebook on the motel room table in the dark of an October morning in 2018. And the person watching the screen was someone who had made choices that she still believed were the right choices, for reasons she still believed were valid, and who was nonetheless sitting in the kitchen of the house on Clover Street feeling the specific weight of what those choices had cost and what they had not cost, and what she thought that number was, and whether the number was right. She called her attorney 2 days later now. Here is where the story gets complicated, and here is where I need you, again, to resist the pull of the simple narrative, because the simple narrative is not the true one. Within 48 hours of the television segment airing, Marcus's social media had grown by 30,000 followers. His catering inquiry inbox had more than 200 new messages. A food distribution company in Atlanta reached out about a potential regional partnership. A Charlotte business publication ran a profile. And the story, the divorce to food truck story, got out into the broader public conversation the way stories get out, through the mutual friend network and the local media coverage and the general human tendency to share things that feel like they confirm what we already believe about the world. The version of the story that circulated on social media was, as versions of stories on social media tend to be, considerably simpler than the actual story. It was the version where Sandra was the villain, and Marcus was the hero, and the food truck was justice, and the television appearance was triumph, and the right people had won, and the wrong people had lost. Full stop. No further questions. Marcus said nothing publicly, not one word. His only response, when a reporter from a regional news outlet reached out for comment on the child support modification story that had somehow also surfaced in the coverage, was a single prepared statement that said his children's mother, and he were working things out privately, that his focus was his children and his business, and that he had nothing further to say. The statement made people, somehow, angrier than anything more inflammatory would have, because it gave them nothing to push against, because it was the statement of a man who had decided that the story was not primarily his to tell, and that the people in it were not primarily characters in a drama for public consumption, and that the only audience that ultimately mattered was the two children who were watching all of this from the inside. Sandra's attorney filed the formal child support modification petition in December of 2021. The proposed new monthly support figure was $3,400, based on an analysis of Marcus's documented revenue across 3 trucks and a growing catering operation. Marcus's attorney received the petition. Marcus received a call. He asked one question. He said, "What does she need for the kids?" His attorney clarified that child support is based on income formulas, not strictly on need. Marcus said, "I understand that. What does she need for the kids?" His attorney ran the numbers again, accounting for actual household expenses, childcare costs, educational costs, extracurricular activities, medical. He came back with a different figure, one that reflected what Jalen and Amara's life actually required, rather than the maximum the formula would support. Marcus said, "Set up a mediation." They met in a mediator's office in Greensboro in January of 2022. Marcus and Sandra in the same room for the first time since the divorce was finalized in 2018. Not in a courtroom, not across from attorneys at a deposition table, in a quiet room with neutral furniture and a mediator who had been doing this work for 15 years, and who said later that the session was one of the most unusual he had ever facilitated, not because of conflict, but because of the specific quality of the silence between these two people, which felt not like the silence of enemies, but like the silence of people who had been fluent in each other and had lost the language and were trying, carefully, to find some portion of it again. The mediation produced a new child support agreement of $2,100 per month, significantly less than Sandra's original petition had proposed. It also produced a voluntary college savings contribution from Marcus of $500 per month per child, which had not been requested and was not legally required, but which Marcus had proposed on his own because Jalen was 12 and Amara was 10. And the cost of 4 years at a decent university was not going to wait for them to figure out how to discuss it. And it produced one more element, an element that nobody who heard about the mediation agreement expected. Marcus proposed, voluntarily, without any legal prompting, that Sandra be hired as a paid contractor for Marcus's table, not in the kitchen, not at events, in the role of family and scheduling coordinator, a role that acknowledged formally and financially the work that Sandra had been doing since 2018. The school pickups, and the doctor appointments and the parent-teacher conferences, and the management of 2 children's emotional and logistical lives, during a period when their family was fundamentally reorganizing itself. Marcus said, in the mediation room, with the mediator and both attorneys present, words that are documented in the mediation record, he said, "Sandra has been running the operation that keeps my children whole and present and showing up every day. I can afford to acknowledge that now. I should have found a way to acknowledge it long before now," Sandra cried. Her attorney asked for a 5-minute recess. The mediator later said he had been doing family mediation for 15 years, and that was only the 3rd time he had ever called a recess for that specific reason. By the fall of 2022, Marcus's table was operating 4 trucks across Charlotte and Greensboro. Marcus had signed a lease on a brick-and-mortar location in the South End neighborhood of Charlotte, a 1,200-square-foot space in a converted textile building, because that felt right for what the food was and where it came from, and he was planning a restaurant opening for early 2024. He had hired 12 full-time employees. Darnell was running daily operations, with the efficiency of someone who had been converted from skeptic to true believer, and now ran things with the fervor of the converted. Gerald was managing catering bookings that had expanded into corporate contracts. Tracy had designed the restaurant's interior signage and branding, and when Marcus showed her the final plans for the space, she looked at the renderings for a long time and then said, "I told you." She said it very quietly. She had been saying it since June of 2019. Jalen was 14. He was coming to the truck on his weekends with his father, not as a visitor, as a worker. He prepped. He learned the line. He had strong opinions about timing and texture that Marcus took seriously because they were informed opinions, and Marcus had never believed in discounting an informed opinion, regardless of where it came from. Amara was 12. She was not interested in the kitchen the way Jalen was. She was interested in the business, She had asked Marcus to explain his catering contract structure when she was 11, and he had printed out the actual documents and walked her through every clause, and she had found an inefficiency in his pricing model. He had adjusted the pricing model. He had told no one about this for 6 months, because he was still processing the fact that a 12-year-old had found something that his accountant had missed. The soft opening for the restaurant was held in January of 2024. Invitation only. Private. The people who had been there from the beginning. Curtis, the electrician, who had rewired the truck in Darnell's driveway in the summer of 2019. Gerald. Keisha, the blogger. Beverly, who showed up in her church best, and who had, by Marcus's personal count, eaten at the truck or at catering events at least 47 times in the preceding 5 years. A number she disputed on the grounds that 47 seemed low. Tracy, who stood in front of the finished interior and cried for the second time. In 5 years, the first having been the day the restaurant's exterior signage went up. Darnell, who sat at a table near the back and looked around the room with the expression of a man who had offered his couch to his brother in October of 2018, and was now sitting in his brother's restaurant and was trying to figure out how to hold both of those facts in his mind at the same time. Jalen and Amara were there, at a table right up front. Amara had a notebook. She had told her father it was for a school project. Marcus suspected this was approximately 50% accurate. The food was everything it needed to be. The short ribs had been refined over 5 years of daily cooking into something that operated at the absolute peak of what that dish can be, which is one of those dishes that achieves its highest expression, not through complexity, but through depth. The depth that comes from time and attention, and the accumulation of small correct decisions over years. The cornbread had, at some point in the previous year, crossed the threshold from being the best cornbread many people had ever eaten into being the cornbread that many people would describe for the rest of their lives as the standard against which all other cornbread would be measured. And there was a new item on the menu that night, a peach cobbler that Amara had helped develop over 4 Sunday afternoons in Marcus's apartment kitchen, workshopping the ratio of fruit to batter to crust to sugar until it was exactly right, and which was, by the consensus of every person who ate it that evening, one of the most affecting things any of them had ever put in their mouths, the kind of dessert that makes people briefly unable to speak. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, the front door of the restaurant opened, and Sandra walked in. She had not been invited. She had not called ahead. She had come because earlier that afternoon Amara had called her. A 12-year-old girl had picked up the phone and called her mother and said, "Mom, I think you should come tonight. I think you should see this." And Sandra had gotten dressed and driven across the city and opened the door and walked into the room that her ex-husband had built from a folding table and 2 propane burners and a notebook and $500, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. Marcus saw her from across the room. They looked at each other, and no one in the room could entirely agree, afterward, on how long that moment lasted. Some people said a few seconds. Some people said it felt longer than that. What everyone agrees on was the quality of the silence in the room during that moment, which was the specific silence of people who have shared something enormous, who have been through the specific intimacy of building a life together, and then dismantling it together, and then watching each other from a distance do whatever came next. Marcus walked across the room. He said, loud enough for the people nearby to hear, "I am glad you came. Let me get you a table." He got her a table near the kids. She sat down. She ate the short ribs and the cobbler. She told Amara the cobbler was extraordinary. Amara looked at her mother and said, very seriously, and without a trace of false modesty, "I know." She stayed for 2 hours. She and Marcus did not have a dramatic reconciliation. They did not embrace. They did not offer each other the kind of redemptive exchange that would make this a tidier story. What they did was occupy the same room and share the same food and be 2 human beings who had hurt each other and had both, in their own ways and on their own timelines, built something anyway. There is a statistic from the U.S. Census Bureau that stays with me when I think about this story. Approximately 1 in 4 American children currently lives in a household where one parent lives elsewhere. That is 22 million children. In the most recent data, 22 million children who are navigating, every single day, the specific complexity of a family that exists in 2 places at once, who are learning, through experience, what it means when people who love each other can no longer live together, and what happens next. Most of those children do not get a story that ends the way this one ends. Most of those children get something less narrative, less resolved, less visible than a restaurant opening and a mother walking through a door and a daughter saying, "I knew." Most of those children get the long, undramatic, daily work of two parents doing their best in a situation that nobody designed and nobody wanted, and that requires, above everything else, the sustained decision to put the children in front of the conflict, every day without ceremony, because it is simply what has to be done. Marcus made that decision in a motel room in October of 2018 with $500 and a notebook. He made it again every single day for 6 years. He made it in the mediation room when he proposed acknowledging Sandra's labor. He made it in every interview and every profile and every moment when the simpler, more satisfying version of the story was available to him, and he chose not to tell it. Because the simpler version would have cost his children something he was not willing for them to lose. The truth is that resilience does not look like what the internet thinks it looks like. It does not look like a montage. It does not look like a single decisive morning where a man stands up and decides to be better. It looks like a Tuesday, and then a Wednesday, and then a Thursday. It looks like opening a notebook when you are not sure yet what you are writing. It looks like making the cornbread on the days when you are not sure anyone is coming. It looks like protecting the people who hurt you from the story you could tell about them. Because the story you could tell is not the only story. And because the most important audience is not the internet. The most important audience is two children sitting at a table in the front of the room, one of them taking notes, one of them waiting to see what their father is going to do next. Marcus Dwayne Holloway walked out of a house in October of 2018 with nothing. He built Marcus's table with $500, a borrowed Canopy, a ghost Popsicle truck, a retired electrician Sunday mornings, a sign woman's faith, an events man's connections, a food blogger's appetite, and the knowledge that his mother had put into his hands before he had words for what it was. He built it in the specific American tradition of making something extraordinary out of what has been overlooked and discarded, which is, it is worth noting, the very philosophy at the heart of Southern cooking itself. The essence of soul food, as a man named Thompson, who runs a restaurant in Utah, said in a local news interview a few years back, is that it came from pain and sacrifice and was turned into something beautiful and delicious. Marcus understood that. He had understood it his whole life. He just needed the right conditions to prove it. Now, before we close this story, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know your answer. When Sandra walked through that restaurant door in January of 2024, and she stood in the doorway of the thing that Marcus had built, what do you think she was feeling? Was it pride? Was it regret? Was it relief? Was it something that does not have a single clean name? Tell me in the comments below. This is one I want to have a real conversation about. And if this story stayed with you, if the image of Marcus opening that notebook in the motel room hit somewhere personal, please share this video with someone who needs to see it right now. You probably already know exactly who that person is. And if you are new here, this is what we do. Real stories, told all the way through without cutting